Welcome to the podcast of the American Diversity Report. I'm Deborah Levine, editor-in-chief and your host. And with me today is a wonderful speaker and leader that you're going to really enjoy. Her name is Ash Beckham, and she is an inclusion activist, inclusive leadership expert, professional trainer, workshop facilitator, motivational speaker, business leader, and author of Step Up: How to Live with Courage and Become an Everyday Leader. Welcome, Ash. So wonderful to have you with us.
Oh, thanks, Deborah. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you have definitely been busy. I know that you have so many keynotes and workshops with very important businesses and corporations. How did you get started in all this?
It was a while ago. I had a lot of friends that started to have kids. It was far before I had kids, and I got to this point, and my activism really was just in being who I was. I was pretty gender nonconforming. I dressed, androgynously. I was out in my community. I thought that was kind of the level of my activism. And then as my friends' kids started to get older, I realized that they would be in these dynamics where they would hear of something, and again, my lens is the LGBTQ world, that they would hear something derogatory or pejorative around LGBTQ people, and you'd have these kids that would have to kind of make this decision, right? Do they make a stand? What are the right words? Like, I think in those peer environments, it becomes so confusing, and so I knew that my activism had to extend on beyond just how I showed up in my community, but really try to be an educator. And knowing for so long that diversity and inclusion work was, this is how you do it, this is how you don't do it. It was very top down, preachy, don't offend anyone, right? And I just think that didn't really work. That didn't really work, and especially didn't work for kids. And so how do we make it more conversational? How do we really get to the point of, I don't want somebody to not use, not say the word gay in a negative way because I told them not to, then they're just not going to say it in front of me, right? If we can understand how that pejorative use makes someone feel, then it kind of makes them think about it the next time they use it. And that to me seemed a much easier way to do it. So I was lucky enough to do some speaking engagements. There were just local events here in the Boulder area, and those kind of build upon each other. And I was lucky enough to get some support and traction online, and all of a sudden an unexpected career was born. And so I've been on that path for the last 10 years, and I love it. It's amazing.
Wow, 10 years, huh?
Yeah, yeah. 2013 was the first, was my first talk. February of 2013 was the first Ignite Boulder talk that I ever gave. It was incredible. I went to an event actually. So Ignite, I don't know if you've heard of it. They have it around some areas locally, and you have 5 minutes exactly to speak about something. The slides auto advance, so it's very entry level speaking, community speaking, and you could talk about anything. Their tagline was "Enlighten us, but make it quick," right? And as I'm sure all of your audience members know, and I can listen to almost anything for 5 minutes, right? I'm interested in things enough that I'll give you 5 minutes, especially if it's something that someone is passionate about or they're an engaging speaker. So I went to this event and heard someone speak, and there was this guy that was talking about his ups and downs with weight loss, which nobody in Boulder talks about, that men never talk about. And this guy was like so funny and so compelling and able to really dive into this topic that was maybe not even taboo, but just not in common conversation, with this like humor and welcoming. And I loved it. And I thought, oh, I want to make people feel that, like the feeling that I had listening to him. I wanted to recreate that. So I, made myself a little I bargained with myself, okay, the next time there's open auditions, I'm gonna give it a shot. I'm gonna submit my idea. And then that was, yeah, 2013 was the first time it happened.
Wonderful. Wow, go you.
Yeah, yeah, it was amazing. And you just want people to change the way they think about something because you present it in a way that they've never thought about it before. And and I think being mindful of how something is received and how it is digested, especially when we get into thorny topics, starting with that empathy in your receiver, giving them the benefit of the doubt, we can expect people to know a lot, or kind of like wag our finger at them. But if what our end goal is to really have them have a better understanding, I think we have to be extra mindful with our approach.
So tell us a little bit more about your approach regarding empathy in inclusion.
Yeah, I think a lot of it for me at least comes from storytelling is super important, right? Like I can give you facts, I can give you data, and I think that that's really important. If you talk about LGBTQ youth being 40% more likely to be harassed at school, or you have kids that are that identify as trans that have 3 times the likelihood of inflicting self-harm, right? Like that's data, and that gets some people, that tugs at your heart, right? But then what do you do? And I think a lot of people, especially when it comes to conversations about diversity, well, I have friends that are Black, or I have friends that are gay, or I have friends that are Muslim, so I can't. Nothing that comes out of my mouth is racist or homophobic, right? And so we don't really think about the way that we impact other people, the way that our words impact other people, the way that our choice of pronouns, right? Or pre-marriage equality, if there was something that went out from your workplace that said bring your spouse, well, what if you couldn't get married, right? Like how are we mindful about, in every interaction we have, that our words are it's not, they're not inclusive because they're not exclusive. You have to be intentionally inclusive, right? Like, who are we leaving behind? How could this be read that made somebody feel like I don't belong there, right? And so I think that takes a lot of empathy, and it's not, you don't have to agree with somebody to be empathetic. You just have to be willing to step in their shoes to see what it's like to be them. And to me, the best way to know what it's like to be somebody else is to share stories and really tell them what it feels like when these things happen, something that you have never experienced, but I can tell you what it feels like. Then we can start to relate. So that's kind of the stepping stone for me in leadership and diversity conversations, is let's just sit down and have a conversation. And if that doesn't seem like an egalitarian platform, if that's this top down where I'm challenging you not to say something that offends me, it needs to be this, to me, a more community driven, all boats rise mentality, because we're then empowering people to be those allies. Because you're going to have, in my scenario, right, like the straight, white, cisgendered male who's in the men's locker room, who's going to have access to places that I don't have access to, right? And so how can they be an ally in that space? And I have a role, to me, in empowering that person to have the right words, to have the conversation, to challenge those microaggressions, right? Because it's exhausting to be the person that always does that. And when we broaden the scope of people that can really change minds, then I think that's when we get that cultural shift that we're all looking for.
Wow. So we need to educate ourselves, educate each other, and
Mm-hmm.
in order to engage more inclusively. How do we do that? I mean, there's just like one of you in all your stories. You can't be everywhere at once. What shall we do to spread the word?
Well, I think it's so important that we realize that it is not the responsibility of LGBTQ people to end homophobia, or people with a physical disability to end ableism, right? It's our collective responsibility. So how do we, like, recently I was watching a podcast, and I do a lot of diversity work like you do, and they all of the speakers described what they looked like on the screen for people that were visually impaired. So I am a 49-year-old, salt and pepper haired, Caucasian, androgynous female. I'm wearing a maroon shirt in a background with a picture behind me. I have short hair, right? Like, I have brown eyes. That description, I never thought of that until I saw it. And now it kind of becomes your default, right? Whenever you're on meetings. And I think it's twofold, right? I think that experience of seeing it happen and then actually putting it into practice does two things. One, for the people that are visually impaired that need that, I think that's obviously a great recognition, and something we're doing to help them have a similar experience. But even more importantly, for the people that are not visually impaired, it sets the standard of what, it starts the conversation. Well, why would you do that? Because you don't think of it, right? Like, that's the definition of privilege. If you're not thinking about that, then it's a privilege that you have. It's in the same way that most heterosexual couples walking down the street don't worry about what's going to happen if they hold hands? That's something that I have to think about with my wife, depending on where we are. I can't blame somebody for not knowing what that's like. That's not their experience. But once I share it, then they know. Then all of a sudden, it changes the way we see things. And so we can have these conversations. It's like putting pronouns in your signature of your email, right? You might be cisgendered. It might be very easy for people to identify that, but it starts the conversation in an educational way. And so often in that, you can put a link at the bottom for people to do research. And then you're putting yourself out there as a leader, as a resource to answer those questions, right? And I think that that's what we need. It's not the mandatory quarterly 1 hour diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Like that's not it. We're beyond that, and that doesn't stick with you. What sticks with you is when you see those changes and those not even accommodations. It's a very distinct intentional inclusion of people that are otherwise marginalized. And that's what we need to be doing.
You know, when I started in diversity, I was a dance teacher, ballet teacher, and I had decided I was going to teach at a school for the deaf and hard of hearing. And so I went, and I couldn't find the office, and I wandered around the campus. I couldn't ask anybody where to go. I ended up in the attic somewhere, totally, amazed that I'm the one that that's totally out of it. And it was a Catholic school, and a nun appeared at the door and didn't say anything, just took my hand and took me down to the office. And I was forever grateful. And what I did from there was learn sign language to be part of their community, but also I couldn't stand the idea that with all I knew, all my degrees, I ended up in their attic,
Right.
lost, So that experience, is something that is just invaluable, and it carries through all different kinds of diversity through your life.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a great example because so often, so many of us that don't live with a physical disability, so many of us that are privileged because of the color of our skin or socioeconomic status or whatever that is, we don't know what it's like to be excluded. The circles that we are in, the conversations that we have, we're never on the periphery, right? And so you just don't know what it feels like until it happens to you. So how do you put yourself in environments where it happens? And that's counter, right? There's an internal part of you. There's that very basic reptilian fight, flight, or freeze that strives for comfort, right? But to me, if you're going to your local bookstore and you don't see broad representation especially in for me, I have two little ones, and so that's our lens right now so often is through children's books. But if you go and your local bookstore isn't showing a broad representation, not of your community, but a broad representation, go to a different corner bookstore, right? Change your corner, I think, is the important part of it. Is it challenging to be the only? Absolutely. But the only way you know what it feels like to be the only blank in the situation is to do it yourself. And I think that's part of it is so many of us have to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because that's where the growth comes from, right? We can sit there and preach and read all the books and do all the things. And I think self-education is super important in this area, but you have to get your hands dirty. You just have to. You have to know you're going to make mistakes. You're going to say the wrong thing, right? But you're going to come back and you're going to get better the next time and you're going to improve. And that's where that comes from with me. Like this diversity, equity, inclusion is no longer, can't be an academic exercise anymore. It just can't. Like that isn't changing lives on the ground.
I totally agree. And that attic will always be part of my brain. It doesn't go away.
Yeah.
It just
To
grows.
not be able to ask anyone, to not have the tools to interact and get what you need when in so many other, it's become a default that's in any other situation that would not have been the case for you. I mean, I feel like that becomes the metaphor in your mind of so many things that you can overlay on that. And we all need those experiences to reference, again, not necessarily for our own growth, but for our empathy for other people. Like, you now know what it's like to feel like that. So when someone is doing their parallel version of that, you can be the nun that holds their hand, right?
That's right. Absolutely. It's one of those things where you pass it along. The kindness
Yes.
that is done to you, you pass it along almost unconsciously, you know?
Yeah, because we have that memory of reflecting of how uncomfortable that felt and how great that help felt. And I think even when we don't experience it, when we know that discomfort, we also know what we would have needed, right? And then we can be that also.
Wonderful, wonderful. Is that what allyship is about? That kindness?
Absolutely. I think allyship is really, by definition, it's advocating for and standing up on behalf of someone that you are not like, right? Someone that is different from you. But that can look a lot of different ways. And there's not one way to ally, right? I think some of us have strength, some of us have inherent power in situations. I think there's certain things that we can do certainly to advocate on behalf of others, but allyship can look like grabbing someone's hand and walking them to the right place. Allyship can look like after a conflict, whether that's, in a school setting or at a meeting, going up to somebody and recognizing that was really uncomfortable. I'm sorry that happened to you. Do you want to talk about it, right? If there's a microaggression or someone's dismissive, I mean, in very basic terms, right? Somebody's dismissive because of your gender, or the assumption that, the woman in the room is the one that's going to take notes, right? Like, it happens, scenarios play out, but what do we do after, right? How are you, just because it doesn't affect you, doesn't mean it doesn't affect the environment. So your role to me as a leader is to step in and say, okay, this is what I think happened. I don't know how that landed with you. Do you want to talk about it? It's just like seeing that it was real and having somebody else recognize that happened, I think is huge. Do you, in the middle of the meeting, toss your computer and make a scene? I don't know. There's times to do that and times not to, right? But I think the most important part for me is that it isn't about the perpetrator of that aggression or of that racism or bullying or whatever. We're there for the person who received it. Like, that's what allyship is. We don't necessarily, it isn't defined in how we as a bystander or an upstander approach the perpetrator. It's how we support the victim. And I don't even like to use that word, but the person that it happened to. That to me is the key part, because what they need is where we should be centered. When I was I worked in a restaurant for years in town, and had really stepped into my role as a self advocate, right? LGBTQ advocate. My outness was I was at a phase where I was almost like seeking out conflict because I felt so confident about myself. Like, I was really, I'm here, and people needed to deal with it, was kind of my attitude. So I was very confrontational in a lot of ways, and for a stretch of time, I think, to kind of reassure myself, I really found power in that. So that worked for me. That's what my courage looked like. And so I was at the grocery store after work, and the friends of mine that worked at the restaurant were undocumented, and so we were both shopping at the same place afterwards, and someone had a very aggressive interaction with them, and I saw it happen, and I like throw on my superhero coat and jump in and like make a scene, a significant scene. I had all the right words, I had all the right front. I mean, I had like the 15-second soundbite to put somebody in their place, very loud, drew a ton of attention to it, right? And my friend just kind of, grabbed her cart and walked away. And I, and I didn't really think anything of it. I was like, well, I think I did a pretty good job, whatever. And then the next day at work, she came up to me and was like, do you know how dangerous that is for me and my family? Like, if that escalates in a way, like, I have the privilege of, like, I don't care if the police are called, like, bring it, right? That was the opposite of her reaction, right? And so how do you want to ally? is one thing. How are you empowered to ally? What tools do you have to ally? But what does the person you're allying for, person slash people, what do they need from you? Right? So that wasn't what she needed in that situation. That actually made the situation worse because I put my lens of what advocacy looked like on that scenario, but it wasn't what she needed. Right? So I think that is super important to know that what allyship looks like has two sides, right? What do we feel compelled to do? What do we feel empowered to do? What do we feel like we have the skill set to do? What do we have the what's our comfort level with awkward, right? Is one. And then also, what do people need us to be? What does that specific coworker need us to be? Do they want a super proactive, aggressive in the middle of the meeting, draw the line? Okay, do you have the capacity to do that? Great. Is it more subtle? Is it more, recognizing this person for, echoing what they said to make sure people aren't taking their ideas? Like, what do they need? And that's where the relationship comes in. And that's what allyship looks like to me, right? Is relationship.
Right, absolutely. And building those relationships takes a little bit of time and quite a bit of thought and energy. Uh,
Yeah,
it isn't something you can just assume you have.
exactly. And knowing that no group of people is a monolith, right? Or how you're going to advocate for somebody in certain situations is different. And that's where their relationship comes in, right? Like, we are not changing minds. We are not changing cultures. We are not changing dynamics of teams or organizations in that 15-second soundbite, which really takes the pressure off of us, but also gives us the time that knowing if that microaggression happened or macroaggression happened, it's going to happen again. So let's get ahead of it, recognize it with our friend, see what they need, and then follow their lead next time. Be more prepared the next time it happens to do what everybody knows is the right thing and the needed thing, as opposed to the impulsive thing and miss the mark.
Yes, indeed. Which means you have to learn to listen.
Oh my gosh. Two ears, one mouth. It's like my favorite thing. Right? Two ears, one mouth. That is for a reason. And so many of us, especially, and I think it's also well intended, right? We get on this advocacy journey and we're like you become an ally and you're like, I'm an ally, I'm an ally. I'm like sitting, waiting, like the spring set to go, ready to kind of let my allyship explode. It is of the best intention. But again, like you said, that listening is so key, because maybe what somebody needs is to be empowered to speak for themselves, which is so much more powerful and so much more impactful on the group, right? So I think that like you said, it's building those relationships and knowing. That's the other thing I feel like about allyship in such a broad way, and diversity and inclusion work in general, is you're in it for the long game. Like, if you're looking for the finish line, you pick the wrong track. You just kind of keep going, and those incremental changes, your ability to have difficult conversations, to engage in awkward conversations, like your tolerance for that changes. They say it gets better, which I mean, I love the Trevor Project, but it gets better to me is not our bar. We get stronger, right? Like, the scenarios around us do not get better. I mean, maybe in the grand scheme, if you take like the 30,000-foot view, it does. But in everyday interactions, we become more resilient. We become stronger. We become better allies. We become better self-advocates, right? We change. The scenario doesn't change. Maybe by our strength in our interaction, we can change somebody on the other side, or at least change the dynamic, but we are an active participant in that. So I think it's important to know that the power that we hold, and that you know um it's not a hammer, right? Like, it is way more nuanced work. It's more, I think, the tiny chisel than it is the sledgehammer.
And it's not about meaning well.
Right.
My Aunt Selma had this great saying. She said, if someone meant well, that means it was the kiss of death.
That's perfect.
Yes,
Ah,
she she was a teacher of um, immigrant children and disabled children. And she understood how people think, you know, and it was a treasure to know her.
Oh my gosh, she sounds like an amazing woman.
She was indeed, as it, it's interesting, the women in my family were all very strong with some very interesting skills. And I've always maintained that women have the capacity, the energy to learn about people and to be a bit nurturing. That sends them into these maybe awkward situations and be able to negotiate and moderate and just be able to influence what's happening in a major conflict. But
Hmm.
we're not always given the chance, are we?
Absolutely. I completely agree. And not, I think that gender certainly plays a role in it. And I think it's more of it's like a default skill for so many women is to bring people together. Like it is that there is something, and obviously outliers and certainly a spectrum. And I know a bunch of amazing men that are great at this as well. But typically women's default, I think, is to bring people together to help, and like you said, to nurture, and that kind of maternal protective, keep them in the nest instinct of, you know uh I feel like there was, once it took my parents a while to get on board when I came out, but once they did, if you had a problem with me, you had a significantly bigger problem with my mom. Like she was going, she did there was, I mean, hell hath no fury like a productive mother. And and that is like beyond bloodlines, but I think there's this just innate empathetic piece. And again, it is, I think, as women are, as we're getting in the workforce, more equal representation in leadership and on boards and what that looks like, there is a significant change in the mindset of an organization. And to say that that isn't impacted by women and then also by increasing diversity within the workforce is completely missing the mark. Like I don't think it's as simple as an evolution of time. Like you have to think of who the players are that are making the cultural change, and it's women and it's people of color and folks that really are bringing their full self and having those conversations and integrating that there isn't only one way, right? There's a multitude of ways, and we're better as an organization if we can recognize that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm hoping that this year, 2023, will be the year that people recognize what is needed to move on to a culture that is inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate all the work that you do in this area. I'm sure that it's time consuming and energy consuming, and we're all very grateful for you doing that. And I understand you have a book. Would you like
I
to
do.
tell us about it?
I did. That the book came out. It could have been potentially in the history of publications the worst time to launch a book, but it was March of 2020. So I feel like the release date was about 7 days after the world shut down. But it is, yeah, it was. So the book started. I had, had been speaking at universities and at conferences and in different places, and had so many people in the audience that would really appreciate this view of a leadership style, right? That included empathy and individuality and authenticity and kind of these, quote unquote soft skills, but the ones that really allowed you to make your leadership style your own. And we had been taught, there's all these kind of like, hard skills and tough negotiating skills. And to me, that didn't really seem to be as effective. That you can balance courage and grace. It was a both and situation, less binary and more quantum, I guess. All of these things can exist at the same time. And so we so I would have these conversations, and after my seminars, people would come up and say, "Oh, Ash, I love that. I love your leadership style. When I graduate, with my master's, I'm going to implement that. Once I become, a senior director, I'm going to implement that. Once I measure, have a more than 10 direct reports, that's when I'm going to do it. But these were people that were just amazing. They were simply amazing. I looked at them as leaders. Their coworkers looked at them as leaders. They would be in these leadership track programs, but they didn't. There was this external validation or set of arbitrary metrics that they felt they had to meet before they could be a leader. And that it wasn't the case, because they had the potential to be leaders right where they were. They could be a leader of one. I mean, you could say, when you're in my office or cube, I will be inclusive, right? I will practice empathy. I can hold courage and grace at the same time, right? All humility, all these things that we were talking about, you could do from right there, and that broader impact. So the chance of one person climbing the corporate ladder and becoming the VP of HR or the CEO of an organization, and then using it as trickle down, is the same chance as winning the lottery. But when you have all these small grassroots teams that are implementing these strategies of really seeing each other on the team and having empathy and figuring out, having these harder conversations, having transparency, speaking with authenticity, when they start to do that, all of a sudden you have this foundation for that to start to build up, and you see the success of these teams that are taking on diversity. So for me, I knew that people needed the encouragement to get started. So when I wrote the book, the intent was from the C-suite to the 7-year-old's soccer team with the kid on the bench, right? You can be anywhere and be a leader. It's how you carry yourself. And it isn't something that it's a lifestyle choice, right? It isn't you close your laptop at the end of the day and then all of a sudden all your leadership stuff goes out the window. These are strong, good, integral human traits that we explore and practice, right? They're muscles that we have to flex. They say, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And kind of the point of this book was to increase that toolbox, so you had the ability to assess the situation and decide, okay, in this situation, I need a little bit of humility, a little bit of grace, but a lot of individuality. And you're picking these certain traits. Or here, I need to have a tremendous amount of courage and a lot of authenticity, right? You're kind of picking the tools that are right for the situation, because it's not a one size fits all. As leaders are not all the same, nor are situations. And so how do we work on some of these skills that we come by naturally, and some of them that we really need to practice to really have this full set of options when we explore what kind of leader we want to be in what scenario?
Wow. Well, can you tell us how we can get a hold of your book? And if there's anything else you'd like to add, please do.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm on all social media at Ash Beckham. Instagram is at the Ash Beckham. I was a little late in the Instagram adoption, so mine was taken. And then website is ashbeckham.com. You can go to any of the independent booksellers online. And then, of course, the big ones to Barnes & Noble and Amazon. They all carry the book. And I love to interact on social. So I would love to do that. And I think I would say, because I know your readers, your listeners are people that embrace action, right? You hear these things and you're great, and then it's the inevitable, what next, which is such an inspiring trait, right? That they're not here just for the academic information, but really want to do the implementation. So I would say, do one thing in the next week, one thing internal and one thing external that makes you feel uncomfortable. That would be it, right? So whether that's following somebody different on social media, looking, the internet is, for good or bad, there's a lot of information out there. So, if you're into, what's happening in LGBTQ communities, or what's happening with certain racial demographics, or with, the struggles with ableism, like find something, find a trusted source and do a little something that you wouldn't necessarily look at, not that's in your regular feed. That's a really great way, actually, for those folks that are on social media, is to intentionally seek out like-minded people that are diverse from you on social media. Get them in your feed. Be people that look different in your feed, that talk about different things, that highlight different times of the year that they celebrate, or or certain things like that. I think that's a really great way to do it because it becomes part of your consciousness. And then I think externally, have one difficult conversation. It doesn't be the most difficult, but have a conversation that's inherently a little bit awkward, right? And see what that feels like. Because again, it's our exposure to that makes that, previous ceiling become our next floor, but we have to do the work. So I guess that would be my challenge. One thing internally uncomfortable, one thing externally uncomfortable, and it'll be on the path for 2023 to be an ally, to be an inclusion activist that we all need so badly. Obviously, keep listening to Deborah and all of her brilliance for encouragement that you need throughout the year.
Thank you so much. I will be looking you up on social media for sure, and we will be sharing this podcast shortly on them. And readers, listeners, you have your homework. I'll be checking on you. And thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Ash, for being who you are and sharing it with us today.
Absolutely, Deborah. It was a pleasure. Thanks for all you do. Keep up the great work.
Absolutely. Let's see here.